Hello, Warfare in the Ancient World, and welcome to the second part of Unit 6, Meet the Trireme. So, when we last left off, Xerxes was getting his backside handed to him in the Gulf of Salamis. What did those ships look like, and what kind of tactics were they capable of doing? And that's the question we're going to segue into here. So this is going to move a little bit afield from historical battles and maneuvers and focus on what we do and rather don't know about warships in the... You're silly. The ancient Mediterranean. Yes, you've met my TA. This is James. Say hi to the students, James. Say hi.
Hi.
Little kiss.
Ma.
Aw, mwah. Without any further ado, let's get into the evidence,
Baba.
such as it is.
Baba.
First stop, a Phoenician ship, not a Greek ship. As I mentioned in the last lecture, there is a lot of overlap in ship shapes and styles because there's a shared culture of navigation and shipbuilding technology in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Archaic period. Okay, yes, you can drink out of the drink bottle. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't differences amongst ships. There are, and these differences are mentioned in passing, but the trouble is the same thing we ran into at Marathon. They assume that you know, and they don't explain it to you, because there really wasn't a point. Everyone could look around and be like, ah, yes, Phoenician ship. That said, there seems to have been no functional difference, certainly between the ships used by the Ionian fleet under the command of Xerxes and the Athenian and Spartan and allied fleets under the command of Themistocles. They're all using triremes. Okay. As you may have noticed, this is an older piece of evidence than the period we're looking at. The Third Persian invasion begins in 481, really 480 BCE.
Baba.
No, we can't blow bubbles. We have to talk about triremes. I'm sorry.
Baba.
I know. Okay, here. You can blow bubbles while I talk about triremes. Sorry, guys. So we're looking at a relief of a Phoenician ship here, and this is a good introductory point to talk about one of the technical terms you'll see when you read about ancient ship types. That is cataphract versus afract.
Baba.
I know, more vocabulary, exactly what you wanted to hear. So a cataphract ship is a ship that has a decking on it between one level and another level. And it comes from the Greek preposition kata, which means down. A catastrophe is when everything just spirals down, like 2020. Opposite omen. Right, so a cataphract is a ship where there is decking specifically between the bay where the rowers are and the decking where other people stand. And looking at this Phoenician ship, it's pretty clear that we're dealing with a cataphract style because you see a row of people manning the oars. They're on the bottom in a row of what looks like windows. And then above them on the upper decking, there are Marines. Marines are already a part of naval warfare as early back as we can go. And if you think about it a minute, it makes sense. One of the first military functions of ship is to carry people from battlefield A to battlefield B, or from a staging ground to M. You get the picture. But then also, they need to be able to fight as soon as possible in that engagement. So they need to be able to fight while on board, off-boarding, and then storming a beach, hence Marines. But in ancient warfare, this also involves manned invasions of other ships. Not to preempt my tactics lecture, but this is going to look a lot more like a land battle than you might think, just, on its face. So a cataphract is a boat with a kind of decking that's solid enough that people can stand on the top. And it seems that even in a very covered ship, you would keep an open area in the center. More about that later, but still there's decking, somebody standing on it. Awesome. Another thing about this decking you'll notice is that there's a railing, and that's very important because if you don't have anything around the edge, it's very easy to fall off, and there are reasons why you need to be able to protect against sudden stops, shall we say. Another thing that's interesting to point out here, the round shields. We've seen these before in shipborne context with the sea peoples back in the Bronze Age. So this is a classic for a reason. The Vikings also used round shields, center grip round shields in the Vikings case, because they work really great for naval warfare and marine warfare in an ancient context. They're light enough that you can jump off a ship with them, although not into the water. You're going to have to drop it if you jump into the water with one. It's not that light. But it is short enough that your legs are free to move. It's not going to get in the way when you're on a crowded decking. So it's an all-around good choice. Let's see, what else did I want to say about this? Yes, so the opposite of a cataphract ship is an afract ship. That A on the beginning of the word is what Greek does to negate a word. So for instance, an asexual person is a person who doesn't feel sexual attraction to other people. That's what the A in asexual is about. Or say an amoral person is someone who does not have a moral compass. Yes, I'll just leave that one there. No Themistocles jokes. All right, we're moving on. Let's see, anything else I want to say? Yes. So the one last issue, and here we're getting into another art as evidence scholarly issue here, is how to interpret the part of the ship that's underwater. And this is going to be a pressing problem because, as we mentioned last lecture, there are wood-eating worms in the Mediterranean, so ships tend not to be preserved except in the not wooden parts of the ship. If the wood gets plowed really far into the seafloor, you might get a few beams, but it is really rare to find surviving ship bits from the ancient Mediterranean. Also, underwater archaeology, that is archaeology done with scuba tanks and submersibles, is a very new part of archaeology. We've only been able to do certain kinds of missions since the 80s, and funding those missions is even more troublesome. So we're going to have a lot more information in the next few years as underwater archaeology continues, at least COVID allowing. Now, the situation is a little better in the Black Sea because the Black Sea is so deep and the quality of the water is such that it preserves ships better, but also it's a really active shipping lane, so we're still scratching the surface of what we can find there. Hopefully soon we'll have more examples of warships, but until then we're kind of stuck with non-wooden parts of ships. There are not many, folks. And artistic depictions of ships. Now you might think, of course there's art of ships, right? This is the Mediterranean. People are getting on boats regularly as part of trade and warfare, and surely there would, no, unfortunately, no. This is one of the few. And again, it's way too early, right? This is two, 200 plus years too early, yeah, for our period. But it's still useful to show that already we have some covered decking, so cataphracts are possible. This round shield with spear wielding marines on the top, that's already happening, and it's not something the Greeks invented, which shouldn't need to be said these days, but apparently it does, because there are certain groups who are very invested in this idea that ancient Greece invented everything useful. And that's problematic for a number of reasons, starting with what does ancient Greece mean to ancient people? Because they're still negotiating that in this period. Suffice to say, another thing that we question looking at this is whether or not we're looking at the keel of the ship. So the keel is, here using my red pen, the bottom piece of wood that stabilizes the ship vertically in the water and helps it to sail straight. So this is often a projecting downward bit of the ship that the ship then bows out from under. We'll see better pictures of it moving ahead. Now, if this is meant to show the keel of the ship in its entirety, then this is a very shallow draft for a boat. So draft is the distance from the water line to the ship's bottom below the water. And depending on the draft of the ship, that tells you how shallow water you can maneuver in. This is very, very important if you happen to, say, be a Viking and you like to sail up rivers and raid, although the Vikings didn't invent that either. The Romans are doing it too, and so is everybody else. So,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye. We're only on slide 2. Okay. It's almost bedtime. Just hold it in there for me, dude. Okay. Now, if this is the full draft of the ship, then yeah, it is really shallow. But what might also be going on here is that these wave formations are meant to show the water up alongside a ship that actually continues much deeper. So this art does not tell us where the keel beam is reliably. Similarly, here at the prow of the ship, you can see a sloping pointed thing, which may be a pointed ram. And these scratches tend to lend themselves to this interpretation. There's a seam line where there's some kind of a fastening. So if this is a piece of bronze that's been put over the keel beam in order to make a pointy end that you can smash into, say, another ship, awesome. But we have the same problem with where the water line is. Now, if this is the entirety of the hull's decking, and that is the entirety of the ram, then we have a really strangely shaped ram with this pointy thing. Because this isn't a really sensible shape for a ram. It's easy to get it bent. It's going to get stuck into things. This isn't going to be able to take a lot of shock over time. It's a puzzling way to make a ram, and also it has no continuity with rams that come later. And also we haven't found any. What is likely to be going on here, perhaps, and again, I'm being cautious, is that the water line is indeed over top of the edge of a ram. So let me clear out the pen. I'm going to clear this out. Awesome. So what is probably going on, and I'm going to do this now in the blue pen, we have the front edge of the ram sloping down to the water line, and then below the water line, the ram would continue in this kind of shape, which is consistent with what we see in later ram shapes. But again, we just don't know, and this is the shape of the questions we have about this. So one last thing to say about this, I swear, and that is with the oars. Now you'll notice that the oarsmen we can see are holding one row of oars here, and the oars are balanced on the top edge of this open window area. And then below them, there's a second row of oars staggered here, like that. So when we have 2 rows of oars on each side of the ship, we call this a Fiveream, because like 2 rows is bi, like a bi person is attracted to 2 genders. So bi is 2, a bicycle has 2 wheels. Biplane has 2 wings, yeah. Likely the artist hasn't shown the second row of oar holders either because artistically it's kind of hard to work them in there, or they're sitting on a lower rank of benches, and their heads are, let me go back to my red pen, like here. Also notice that the folks holding onto the oars are facing away from the ram. That's fine. You pull backwards when you're rowing a ship. You can see at the top, this person here pointing ahead as lookout is indeed looking front in the direction that the ship is going. Are you eating the bubble wand? Okay, I've got to shut this situation down. Be right back for our next ship. All right, welcome to the Letterman Relief. This was found in Athens. It dates to the year 410 BCE, which astute observers will notice is not during the Persian Wars. Now we're too late. 410 BCE is during the Peloponnesian Wars, so Athens is at war with Sparta at this point. 480 BCE is the Battle of Salamis, so this is decades afterwards. This is a picture of a trireme, which was the backbone of the fleet during the 5th century BCE in Athens and really elsewhere. Ionia, Sparta, everybody's using triremes. They're state of the art for this century. And you're now looking at the best artistic evidence we have of one of these things. It's broken, the paint's gone, it's missing parts. Yeah, this isn't very good. This combined with literary texts gives us enough information that we've been able to guess at a reconstruction. We'll be looking at that a little bit later, but now I'm going to talk you through the evidence that this art gives to that interpretation and how we as historians take this apart. Starting with the cataphract versus aphract question. So if you look at the top, you can see here there's this wrinkled bit of what looks like cloth. That's because it's cloth. This is the sail that has been lowered, and the mast would be lowered along with the sail. And masts were likely put into a socket so that they could be picked up and lowered really, really fast. Why, you may ask? Well, this has to do with the hybrid drive of a trireme, and really every galley through all of the periods we'll be talking about in this course. This is pretty standard. If you were becalmed, right, if there's no wind, you'd want to have the option to put rowers on the benches so that you can continue to move ahead, especially in the Mediterranean. Storms blow up quickly. Remember Darius's first Persian invasion. You don't want to end up under the sea. So having oarsmen means that you can drive precisely and you can keep going when becalmed, but people get tired. There's only so long you can row, and you can bring extra people to help you row, but there's only so many people you can cram into one of these ships. If you look at this, this is not just the people you're looking at here. So here's the person sitting on the top bench. The person sitting on the next bench is probably around here because that's where the next oar sticks out. And then here's a third row of oarsmen, so there's somebody's head here. So everybody's forehead is roughly up to the next level's butts. So you are sitting on a hard bench, and we know from these literary records that you could get hemorrhoids from sitting on these benches. It was a real problem. Rowing very, very fast under stress in the Mediterranean, where it's hot, sweating onto each other. They're also eating quite a lot of beans and whole grains, so they're very active digestive systems are doing what they do. Also, the parasite loads, man, the parasite loads. So I'll just let your imagination ruminate on what that would be like for a minute. And then you could see how if you had extra people, first, where do you put them? You're likely already carrying Marines, too, who have to either hang out on the top deck or somewhere down below if they're ducking to avoid fire during an engagement. So you don't really have extra oarsmen sitting around, so you do have to rest your people. That's why oarsmen are used either when the boat is in active combat or for brief bursts in a becalmed emergency. Most of the time, this boat's going to be sailing, well, under sail. And you can also row and use the sails at the same time. The two work synergistically, and your ship gets up to a much higher speed. So, nice. In the period we're talking about for the Battle of Salamis, the 480s, ships are still being crewed by citizens. These are the citizens who can't afford hoplite gear. So if you're not lucky enough to inherit a shield and some armor, you're going on a trireme. By the time we get into later periods, when freeborn Athenian citizens are doing a little bit better and not quite as eager to volunteer for oar duty, you sometimes do get enslaved people rowing ships. However, they are not chained to the oars, and the Romans never do that. Just putting that out there. But in general, this is hot, sweaty work that people did try to get out of and complained a lot about having to do. So this was not a popular job, and that perhaps accounts for some of why we don't see a lot of naval scenes in pottery, because pottery tends to have things that are fun to look at and or glorified. We're running into a problem akin to the heroic nudity problem. But it makes sense that when we do find ship art, we're going to find it in Athens, because Athens commits heavily to the navy, and that could account for why these folks seem to be naked. That might be heroic nudity. They certainly look unusually muscular, but also they're rowing a trireme, so I don't know why that surprises me. But this could actually be real news, because this was hot, sweaty, nasty work, and you could get chafed if your clothing was rubbing, so doing it naked makes sense as well. Hopefully they're wearing something between them and the benches, though. If not, that would explain the hemorrhoids, wouldn't it? So, first thing we notice, there is a top decking, so we have a cataphract. The sail has been hastily put down because this is not an evenly folded sail, so likely we're looking at a battle scene, and that's useful to us because it shows us what combat rowing looked like. And indeed, these folks are all rowing in time. They look very professional. They're super into it. Another thing we can tell from looking at this is how the oars are organized through the sides of the trireme. You can see the top row is balanced over the top of this open side decking. The next row, the damage makes it kind of hard to tell, but it looks like the next row of oars is coming out here, and then the next row is here, and then the bottom row here. We can see in these kind of knobby projections here what we find mentioned in literary text. This is likely a gasket. We'll look at it on the recreation moving ahead. So even though this is a really beat up piece of very fragmentary evidence, we can get a lot of information out of it. But there are some disappointments too. We, for whatever reason, can't see the decking of the siding of the ship. It kind of peters off into the void. We can't see the keel, we can't see the hull shape, we can't see the ram, and it's broken at either end, so we can't see the prow either. There's a lot of information that needs filled in. So let's look at how we did with that. Oh yeah, before we do, one more piece of evidence. This is a terracotta from Egypt, 300 to 350 BCE. So either about the time Alexander, well, really Macedon is rising, Alexander is making his invasions, 323 Alexander dies, and the Ptolemaic kingdom becomes a thing. So this is in the early period of a transfer of power from Persian rule in Egypt to Greek-speaking rule in Egypt. And this does seem to be perhaps a variant trireme, and it's got some very useful information. That the shape of the prow has this square ram shape, so this tells us combat vessel. There are two layers of people on it, one with the round shield, and you can kind of see like vaguely stylized heads here, so this looks like a cataphract deck. It's got an open side, which we've seen before, and then these projections here that might have had oars in them back in the day. Now this, like the Phoenician ship we were looking at before, just has two rows of oarsmen. Likely this is a smaller vessel. And it also has a very shallow draft, right? An improbably shallow draft. It kind of tapers, so maybe they're hinting at a keel, but really it seems that the sculpture sort of gave up at the waterline. So this is in keeping with what we've seen earlier, but this also shows how conservative ship design in general is. We've seen the same basic concept, the ram on the front, the cataphract decking with the marines on top and the rowers on the bottom, and rows of oars to give you more pulling power. But the basic shape of our warship has remained pretty constant here. Cool. So let's take all of this and see what we get. Okay, so here is a line drawing of a trireme, and I've gone for this first just so you can see the schematic before we look at my pictures of the Olympias, the reproduction ship. At the front, this is the front end here, where it looks like it's got a little face on it and cute little chubby cheeks. I think triremes are adorable, by the way. If anybody finds a plushy trireme, alert me immediately. Right. So at the front, there's a bronze ram. We'll be looking at these in a minute, kind of fitted on like a nose or a snoot. And then a high beam prow wedged into a keel beam that continues from the ram directly down and then curving up to a sweeping stern that kind of curls around and back. This we take from later ship models, literary evidence. We're pretty sure about this detail. The decking side, so the fract part of the cataphract, includes an area called the poop deck, which is the word that eventually gives us the bathroom word, not the other way around. It's from the Latin pupus, meaning stern. We can also call it the stern of the ship. Here's the prow end. And then there's a gap in the decking. We're pretty sure on this too, due in part to the Letterman Relief. So the decking doesn't continue all the way across the top of the ship. Instead, there's a gap where you access the oar bays, and also where you can very quickly take the mast down. So you can pick up the mast from its socket, lower it really, really fast. The sail will go away, and then it won't be catching the wind while you're maneuvering around and getting yourself in position, ramming, disengaging. You need to be able to maneuver precisely when you're engaged in sea combat, and you're gonna want to use oars only for that in most circumstances. Okay, anything else I wanted to say here? Yes. So we call this a trireme because it's got 3 rows of oars. So the person on the top, middle, bottom, 1, 2, 3, tri, like a tricycle. Where's my camera? There it is. What else? Tricycle, triathlon, triad. That's another one. Yeah, so 3. As opposed to 2 rows of oarsmen, which is a bireme. All right, so as promised, let me introduce you to the Olympias. The Olympias is a modern trireme that's been reconstructed through a combination of guesswork, text work, and very limited archaeological evidence. This was then taken out to sea and used as an active ship. It's still an active ship in the Greek Navy. It's really nifty in person, and I've given you some video of it at sea at its original sea trials in the mid-90s. Okay, so a couple key features, as I mentioned. The ram is the thing that makes a warship for pretty much the entire period we'll be dealing with. And I'm talking right on through from the Phoenicians into Rome. Just how we do here. And this ram design remains pretty consistent. Rams we found look like this. It's riveted into the strongest beams of the ship, including these bracers along the side, the keel beam here. The keel beam is important because it keeps the ship stable so it doesn't wobble over and capsize. It keeps it sailing straight, and it also creates some resistance to rough and choppy waters, a very important part of the ship. The deeper your keel, the more stable the ship, but especially if you put things on top of the ship, which is going to be really important when we get to Rome and the Roman Navy. But the deeper it goes, of course, the deeper your draft, the less shallow waters that are accessible to you. So you have to be careful when you play the game of keels. And every time you add a new row of oars, you need to make your draft deeper. And that's going to be important when we move to the Hellenistic period. Okay. So another thing we know about from literary records and some artistic records is that triremes always had eyes on the front. This was a nod to the mythological first ship, the Argo. It had a beam in it that was a talking oak tree that was sacred to Hera. It gave people advice. It was awesome. This is not, however, a standard feature of a trireme, alas. However, the eyes are, and this is partly to give the ship a soul. Ship names in ancient Greek were a thing, and I think they were mainly female names. I need to check that with my colleague, but I'm 90% sure I'm remembering this accurately. But yeah, ships had names, they had personality, and a part of that was in the face, in the eyes. And it's also an intimidation tactic, because remember, the water line, I'll do this in blue, is here. So if you are sitting in your own trireme looking out your window, that eye is going to be eye level with you as the ship is bearing down on you, and it's going to be freaking scary. If you do decide to read the Persians when we do next unit on the Peloponnesian Wars and Greek tragedy, you'll notice in one of the choral odes they have this moment where they mention the fierce, rapacious ships with their eyes coming closer and closer. It's one of my favorite moments in that play because I think it gets at what it must have felt like to be stuck in a naval battle at your oars, underneath the decking, rowing your heart out, looking out to your side and seeing, oh crap, here comes another ship. Super terrifying, also very cool. Let's see. The rest of this we'll look at in the upcoming slides. Here's the ram closer. These shapes are all cast into the bronze. You'll see a seam. This has been cast in two pieces and then soldered together along this axis. And these U-shaped reinforcement beams and these very long raking jutting, almost like an I-beam, but it's more like a double-sided E-beam instead, I guess. These are important because you don't want to add any more weight than you can help on the front of your ship, because the more weight you put on the front of your ship, the more off balance it gets. Remember, ships don't just like hang on a frame most of the time. They're sitting in the water and they're going to tip and tilt as the balance shifts, particularly a warship where you have Marines running about on the decking. You're going to have balance issues if you don't watch what you're doing. And if you put too heavy a ram on the front, then your ship is going to be front heavy and it's going to kind of dive into the water. You're going to have to counterbalance that. Now, the more weight you put into your ship, the less fast your ship is. But if you don't have enough ballast, if it doesn't have enough weight on the bottom, it'll tip over. And this is a battle that ship designers still have to constantly contend with. So what they've done is create the best of both worlds. There's enough bronze to give this strength, and they're jutting shapes that help the bronze to tear and claw as it rams into other ships and or things. But the cutouts provide added strength because a cutout shape is more stable to shock and to pressure and to shearing forces than is necessarily a solid block. This is a real smart idea. Also, this kind of pronged shape doesn't get as stuck in things, although it can still get stuck in things, but that's going to be important moving ahead. This is attached, as I said, with rivets. You can see them in here, and these go deep, deep into the wood. This is the athlete ram, so this is an actual ancient ram. This is the part of the ship that survives, so we have tons of these things. This is one that was found off the coast of modern-day Israel, and you'll notice the date is super wide, like 530 to 270 BCE is a really long time. That's because rams looked like this for this long. It's a really conservative design element in ships. This also gives you a good idea of what these looked like. It's even got some what looks to be some banging damage. So I think this ram has had its best ram life. On the front of it, you can see the caduceus of the god Hermes, who was the messenger of the gods and of trade and of travel, and also the person who led you to the underworld when your body had died. Kind of pick up your soul and make sure you got to your taxi stop on the river Styx. That works on a number of levels. It's a good choice. Here are a couple more. There are a lot of these. This one I particularly like because it still has the keel beam, like a little bit of the keel beam hung on there. This went so deep into the sea floor. And not just the beam, but you can see the rivets still in place. And look how deep and long these are. I mean, these are going more than halfway through the keel beam. So these are impressively deeply embedded because of all of the force that the ram has to take. Eventually, the Romans, when they win a naval victory, they start taking the rams off of the ships that they total and then using them as war trophies. They set them up in the forum as a bragging rights kind of thing. Okay, so here's the Olympias at sea. I won't spend too much time on this because there's a video, but it's nifty to look at, and it gives you a sense of what this may have looked like back in action, but it also gives you a sense of how tricky it is to coordinate the rowing. There are a couple phases of the training required for the group that first sailed the Olympias on the video. And you'll notice first they're on this mock-up. We're just figuring out how to not knock the oars into each other. Even if you've rowed crew, you're only rowing in a monoream, essentially. There's just like one row of oarsmen. When you add another row of oarsmen, that's a whole other row you have to coordinate with. And if anybody's a little bit off, you're going to smack each other's oars, and your boat's going to be very confused. So you need to be on your game and paying attention and not slacking. And if just one of you gets tired, things can escalate a bit. So they're filling the sails with wind here, and they're tacking a little bit. You can see where they've pulled up this edge of the sail to start a turn. So they've got their oars up out of the water, but you can see as they're resting, the oars are all knocking into each other and looking a little goofy here. Another thing I love about this is it shows you just what this thing's face looks like when it's in the water. It's super, focused. Love it. And you can also see the shape of the ram in the water as it's biting into the waves. It looks like that spiky, pointy shape that we saw on the Phoenician relief. And this is why I think the Phoenician ram isn't a pokey spike. It's probably a ram that looks very much like this ram here. Okay. The planks making up the body of the ship was done with a mortise and tenon joint. This we know from literary evidence and the little bits and pieces of ships that have survived. This is a way of putting together a boat that doesn't require any metal nails. Everything is wooden, and when you put it in the water makes the wood swell until it's watertight. So a mortise and tenon is where you create a slot on both sides of two adjoining planks, and then you put in a little pin, and then when this plank goes into the plank above it, then you slide the dowel in below and above, and that locks it in place. And when it's wet, it soaks, and that's watertight. This is not the only method for building a ship. You're probably familiar with, in wooden ships, what we call a clinker-built ship. This is like a Viking longboat where pieces of wood are overlapped, kind of like shingles. This isn't that construction technique. It's another one. There's still yet an older technique that involves wood cut into these little precise shapes that was used for Red Sea sailing boats in Bronze Age Egypt. Very cool, very irrelevant. At any rate, this is what we mean by mortise and tenon joints. We still use this in carpentry and in housemaking, not so much naval engineering anymore. And here it is in person. Lovely mortise and tenon joints all put together. You can see the decking. And then one of my favorite details, if you recall, on the Egyptian terracotta and the Letterman Relief, there are these little knobbly areas on the bottom row of oars. In literary texts, goatskin gaskets are described, and this is really important because these folks are right above the water. The water is here. So if you're rowing through an oar that's right at the water line and there's a hole right at the water line, you can see where this would escalate into a bad situation really quickly because there's a whole row of these holes right above the water line. How do you keep water from just gushing in whenever there's a wind? Well, that's what the goatskin gaskets are for. It's also tied tightly around the oar, and just like wood, goatskin swells in the moisture, and that creates a tighter seal. Before rubber, this is how you did waterproof gasket seals. You'd use oiled leather, and this would have to be replaced pretty frequently because it's sitting in salt water. Oh, I forgot. Right, the reason why the ram is made out of bronze and not like iron is, well, think about what happens to iron in the presence of water and salt and oxygen. Yeah, you don't want to put that on your ship. Bronze. Now, copper does get a patina. You get verdigris as it reacts with oxygen in the air and a little bit of moisture, but it doesn't corrode a ton. Bronze is really very stable over time, and the patina is pretty superficial. I mean, it'll turn your skin green, but the body of the metal will maintain its structural integrity over time. This is why bronze is still the metal of choice for naval applications. It lasts really well in most seas, not so great in the Pacific, though. Oh well. So here is the Olympias from the front looking on, so you can see the one other thing that we've interpreted from the Letterman Relief, and that are these reversed curve-like structures holding an outer rigger here. So the top oarsmen are sitting not just flush with the side of the decking or rather with the sides of the ship, but they're positioned out over the water a little bit so that they can get a good angle. And this is how you manage to put 3 rows of oarsmen onto the side of a ship and still be able to all reach the water with your oar. Because the higher up you are, right, the longer your oar is, and think about the physics here, right? You're putting your pivot point, your fulcrum, farther and farther away from the point of contact with the water, which means you've got to pull harder and harder. So how do you mitigate that? This is one way you can do it. You widen your ship a little bit. It also provides a bit more stability, and it makes sense. And then when you look in, you can see all of these. Back on the Letterman Relief, it was kind of hard to see which lines were oars and which lines weren't. There seemed to be like more lines than there should be oars. That's likely because you're seeing both the lines for these reinforced curved planks and also the oars sticking out. So there are a lot of vertical elements in this design. You can also see a nice light anchor hanging from a capstan here in the front, all hooked up and ready to go. So close up on the leather gaskets. Right, now as I mentioned, keel beams, we don't have as much information as we'd like, but you can see it here in the reproduction. It's going to show up mostly at the bottom on the outside of the ship, but it continues up all the way here into the body and then all the way front. So a keel beam is going to be one continuous long piece of wood in an ideal world. As more and more triremes were built, deforestation became a real problem in the Mediterranean. It was an early man-made ecological crisis, and one that ancient people did activist work about, including my favorite dude, Pliny the Elder, who, full confession, favorite ancient author. I love that guy. He is great for a number of reasons, but one of my favorite reasons is that he's an early writer advocating for sustainable forestry and not overfishing waters, and also for human rights as an ecological sustainability goal. I mean, okay, he's problematic. He's a Roman. He's problematic, but gosh darn it, this gives me some hope in a very existential way these days. It, the ancient world, yeah, had lots of problems. Our world also has lots of problems, but ancient people were already pushing back and trying to fix the problems, and eventually they did in some part get traction. I mean, the environmental one is a bit more depressing than, say, human rights, like outlawing slavery. Very good move. Took a while. But even back in the day, people are already saying, enslaving people who are the victims of warfare is kind of a sketchy move. Like, maybe this isn't fair to people. And I love that we can find that in the ancient world, because that's a connection with our humanity too. Like, humans can be awful. We really just are the worst sometimes. But humanity isn't necessarily awful either. There are a lot of really great humans and people who, in every time and in every place, in every context, choose to be better and to try to help other people live a better life too. And that really helps me to think about. Anyway, thank you for coming to my therapy moment. Let's continue on with triremes. So here we're looking at the rudder design, and this is one of several possibilities based on later designs and also literary texts. So what we have here is a thing in Greek called a zeugma, which means a yoke, and the metaphor is taken from oxen driving. So when you have 2 ox oxen is the plural. You have one on one side, one on the other in this kind of, get my red pen back here, this shape like so. And then you'll have like one ox head here, one ox head here, and then you'll use the yoke to drive them here at the back from a single person. That's what we've done here with the yoke setup. So we have one long rudder oar here, another one going up through here, and then you'll notice there's a rope that's tied between the two of them. So you sit on a bench here and then you pull back and forth, and that steers the ship from the back. So it's rear steering, sail driven oars on a good day. This is, by the way, another possible setup with a rudder. We see it attested to in later periods. This has two people steering, one of them in the lower deck with a rudder that's in between the top two, and then our upper rudder has the two twin oars, which would then be yoked to each other. One other, probably both. Each trireme was made individually and it's handcrafted, so you could get quite a lot of variation in the details here. And then one last view of the Olympias here straight on. This might be the last thing you see before you die at the Battle of Salamis. Keep in mind, no matter whether you're an Athenian or a Spartan or an Ionian or an Egyptian or a Phoenician, because you'd all be using the same basic boat shape, but this would be it. These two eyes would come at you. The use of blue color in the eyes was a bit of a folklore magic thing. So this was associated with this concept called the evil eye, which you've probably heard of because this is still a thing in Mediterranean cultures. We think that some of what might have gone into this is that blue eyes were quite unusual, especially in the earlier periods of the Mediterranean, so that when they were seen, they were startling, they made people uneasy, and there was this fear that if somebody with blue eyes looked at you funny, you could be cursed somehow. In later years, even as blue eyes became more common in the Mediterranean region, because it's a very ethnically diverse place, the Mediterranean, then other kinds of eye disorders got more associated with evil eyes. So things like pupil malformations plus blue eyes, of which there are a whole bunch. But even so, just a blue eye on its own was still felt to evoke the concept of the evil eye, and then you could wear one yourself so that if the evil eye saw you, well, you had an evil eye too, so it couldn't hurt you because, you've got one. Nice. That is likely why blue eyes show up on ships, because this was the most intimidating eye you could possibly have coming at you. Nifty.